The question is the amendments be agreed to. I call the member for Mindy.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker. We are in the extraordinary position tonight in this parliament that we are debating some amendments that have been moved by the minister opposite, who hasn't actually outlined what those amendments are.
Correct. He doesn't know. He doesn't know.
He may not know, but let me not presume he doesn't know. But we are in the extraordinary position where a minister at the table has moved amendments 1 to 9 and has not actually spoken about the amendments before the House. And one would wonder why a minister would move amendments in this place and not actually have the seriousness to outline to the chamber what the— he says he interjects, and I take the interjection. He takes the interjection. I take the interjection. He says he did brief me. Yes, he did. But did he do the courtesy tonight of actually outlining to the parliament, outlining to the House of Representatives, outlining to the people of Australia why amendments 1 to 9, whom I could ask people on this side and that side of the chamber what they are, and I suspect not one person in this House, apart from the minister and myself, could actually tell you what those amendments are, of actually outlining what those amendments are. So let me say something. Let me say something about the amendments which are being moved, because obviously they are so concerning to the minister that he can't actually outline them to the chamber tonight. Now, these amendments actually reinforce the very reasons why we on this side of the parliament believe that this legislation should be rejected. Absolutely rejected. Because the amendments fall into 3 categories, Madam Deputy Speaker. The first amendment is to say to congregations, to parishes, to church and faith groups around Australia, if your building fund, to put it in lay language, if your building fund doesn't exceed $250,000, we're not going to force you, as the legislation currently does, to establish a separate DGR status, a separate tax-deductible status. That's what the First Amendment does in relation to this. But what this amendment doesn't do is actually index that $250,000. So if the minimum reporting requirement under this legislation, as one would expect over time, moves from $250,000 to $300,000 or $350,000 or whatever, they're going to be still kept at this same level. So this amendment doesn't deal with the future so far as this is concerned. Yes, this is an attempt by the government to placate the churches who have said this is an absolutely unacceptable contribution so far as we're concerned on what we're doing normally that nobody's ever complained about. The second measure here, the minister hasn't outlined this, so I might as well outline it to the parliament. The second measure here is to actually deal with non-government schools, as to say that the plethora of reporting obligations that you have to the Department of Education, we will accept for 3 years only, those reporting requirements for the Charitables and Not-for-Profit Commission. But of course, that just reinforces our objection to this, because after 3 years, what happens? You have the duplication of reporting to the education authorities and also to the Charities Commission. So that just reinforces our objection to this legislation. And then finally, there is something which is common sense, which should have been part of the legislation in the first place, but this is to placate the Greens and the member for Melbourne's objection, and that is in terms of the actual regulatory requirements for governance standards, and it says essentially that the minister has to sign off that the governance standards have been agreed to by the sector. That should have been something which was part of the legislation from the outset. These are essentially minor transitory changes that are not going to change our fundamental objection to this legislation. This is flawed legislation. Yes, we won't oppose these amendments. Why won't we oppose them? Because they are sensible amendments that should have been there in the first place. They should never have been part of the legislation. The minister should have explained them. Our objection to this legislation, which is to make the charitable sector in Australia an instrument, an agency of the government, that's unacceptable, and we will vote against it.
The question is that the House do now adjourn. I call